On January 17, 2014, officers arrived at the home of 52-year-old Harold Sasko. They discovered his bloodied body. During the investigation, it was revealed that an 18-year-old girl, whom everyone believed to be his stepdaughter, had been living with him. However, she was nowhere to be found at the crime scene. When officers uncovered what had transpired in that house, the entire community was shocked.
I will.
Sarah Gonzalez McLynn was born on July 9, 1994. She grew up in Topeka, the capital city of Kansas, USA. For several years of her childhood, she didn't attend school and was homeschooled instead. Sarah grew up as a naive and shy child, but also very kind and attentive. She had a younger brother with a disability, whom she always cared for, and an older sister, to whom she was very close. When Sarah was still just a child, a neighbor began to abuse her. This caused her severe trauma that deeply affected her life. She started having nightmares, reliving the abuse in her dreams, and would wake up in panic. The stress and anxiety made it impossible for her to live peacefully. At that point, Sarah began running away from home and consuming alcohol. Her parents, alarmed by her behavior, decided to take her to a psychologist to help her cope with the trauma, but the situation didn't improve. Things at home only got worse and worse. Around the same time, her parents divorced, which deeply impacted her. According to Sarah, the divorce made her feel unloved at home. Over time, she completely lost contact with her father, and her relationship with her mother grew increasingly strained. Sarah felt out of place in her own home and longed to leave as soon as possible. Clearly, to escape from home, she needed a job. At the age of 14, Sarah started working at a pizzeria. The owner of the establishment was a middle-aged man named Harold Sasko. At first glance, Harold seemed like a successful and upstanding individual. At the time, he owned 3 pizzerias and was a devout Christian. But his employees had a different opinion. They described Harold as inappropriate and untrustworthy. One employee, Terry David, a manager at one of the pizzerias, shared that Harold insisted on hiring only young, attractive girls. Clearly, this made Terry uncomfortable, and every time he hired a girl, he warned her to be cautious around their boss. When Sarah was hired and received this warning from Terry, she was still very naive. She thought he was exaggerating. As Sarah began working at the pizzeria, Harold started talking to her more and more. Over time, he gained her trust. He even began picking her up from school, driving her to work, buying her gifts, and encouraging her to open up about her problems. Harold told her to think of him as a father, but he also told her to keep everything secret from her mother. Sarah obeyed him, and her family never knew about their relationship. At the same time, when Sarah was 16, she experienced another traumatic event, this time involving a close friend. According to Sarah, they were spending time together when he suddenly pushed her onto a table. The table broke, and he overpowered her. As if that wasn't enough, he burned her back with a cigarette. This incident deeply affected Sarah. By then, she had been making progress in therapy, overcoming the trauma of her childhood experiences. But now, with this new violation, the ghosts of her past returned. Sarah resumed therapy, and this time she was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Things quickly spiraled out of control. The stress and depression intensified to the point that the teenager attempted to end her life. At 17, Sarah was placed in a psychiatric hospital for some time. There, she received therapy and medication to help her recover. When Sarah was discharged, she continued taking her prescribed medications and attending sessions with her psychologist. This began to help her cope with everything she had endured. However, the situation at home was extremely tense. Sarah couldn't bear the oppressive atmosphere in her house. By the time she was hospitalized, she was no longer working at Harold's pizzeria, but they had stayed in touch. Harold would pick her up from school, take her out to lunch, and ask about her life. The 50-year-old man saw an opportunity when Sarah was at her most vulnerable, and he decided to take advantage of it. During that period of Sarah's life, Harold repeatedly suggested that she move in with him. He was single, had no children or obligations, and lived alone. Moreover, his business was thriving, and he assured Sarah that he could help her financially. Harold even offered to pay for her college education. Sarah repeatedly refused. She didn't want to move in with Harold, even though she desperately wanted to leave her house. The constant arguments with her mother had become a daily ordeal, often heated and emotionally draining. Finally, in 2012, when Sarah graduated from high school and turned 17, she accepted Harold's offer and moved in with him. At the time, it felt like the beginning of a new life. She believed that with Harold, she would have everything she needed, and at first that seemed to be the case. Harold provided Sarah with everything essential. He enrolled her in college, gave her food, a roof over her head, and didn't ask for anything in return. He bought her gifts, paid close attention to her needs, and even indulged her desires. But everything changed when Sarah turned 18. During this time, Harold began making inappropriate proposals to Sarah. He suggested that she engage in a physical relationship with him as repayment for everything he had done for her. Naturally, she refused. For months, while Sarah lived with Harold, they pretended to be stepfather and stepdaughter to avoid misunderstandings and misinterpretations of their relationship. Sarah had never thought this man, who had assured her he cared for her like a father, would ever ask her for something so outrageous. According to Sarah's mother, she had always opposed Sarah moving in with Harold, but her daughter never listened. Several people close to Harold and Sarah even shared that she called him Dad, so when Harold asked her for intimacy, it completely shocked and disgusted her. When Sarah refused, Harold became furious. He implied that if she didn't comply with his demands, she would lose her home, her financial support, and everything else he had provided. Harold also knew about Sarah's struggles with substance use in the past, including alcohol and illicit drugs, which she had started experimenting with at a very young age. Exploiting this vulnerability, Harold offered her various prohibited substances. When Sarah was under the influence, he attempted to force himself on her and even assaulted her multiple times. Each time Sarah resisted, Harold grew angrier, more aggressive, and crueler toward her. Eventually, Harold gave Sarah a detailed list of everything he had ever bought for her and demanded that she repay him every cent before she could leave his home. He manipulated her further by threatening to sue her for unpaid debt if she tried to escape. At the time, Sarah had a steady job but earned only minimum wage. Her income was nowhere near enough to cover Harold's demands. Among his claims were 2 expensive cosmetic surgeries he had pressured her into undergoing. One was a nose job, and the other was buttock implants. The second surgery caused her so much pain that she had to take medication for months afterward. For these 2 surgeries alone, Harold demanded $16,000 from Sarah. On top of that, he insisted she reimburse him for gifts, as well as rent for the months she had lived in his house. Sarah felt trapped. Returning home to her mother wasn't an option. Harold had manipulated her emotionally and psychologically, convincing her that she was unwanted at home and that no one there would accept her. Her behavior changed completely. From a quiet, naive girl with a kind heart, Sarah turned into an aggressive young woman who refused to talk to anyone and lashed out at even the slightest comment. According to Sarah, her thoughts began to shift over time. Dark ideas consumed her mind, and she started feeling a desire to kill. It began with a visit to a pet store where she bought rabbits. At home, she killed them with a knife, skinned them, and then ate them. Harold witnessed all of this, but said nothing to her. Instead, he mocked her. When Sarah wasn't at work, she stayed at Harold's house. She was often under the influence of substances, drinking alcohol, or in a terrible mood because of everything she had been through. At one point, she started taking antidepressants, hoping they would help her. Weeks passed, but the medication had no effect. She then switched to stronger ones, but those didn't help either. Eventually, Sarah spiraled into self-destruction, and it was only a matter of time before something terrible happened in that house. On January 17, 2014, police officers arrived at Harold's home. His colleagues had reported him missing after he hadn't shown up at his pizzeria for several days, and they couldn't reach him. The officers knocked on the door multiple times, but no one answered. They decided to look through the windows and noticed something alarming. One officer spotted a man's body lying in a pool of blood. The police forced the door open to enter the house. Inside, they found Harold's lifeless body. Near it, there were several empty beer cans. His body was taken to the medical examiner's office for an autopsy. It was determined that Harold had died from multiple stab wounds to the neck. Additionally, a report revealed that the beer cans contained traces of sedatives. The police knew Sarah had been living in the house with Harold. When they searched the home, they found her phone. Concerned about her age, they initially believed she might have been abducted against her will. Later, the officers learned that Sarah had called her workplace, informing them she would be absent for a few days due to a relative's death. The police spoke with her family. Her mother revealed that Sarah had tried to contact her grandmother. Tracing the calls, the officers discovered they had been made from payphones at various convenience stores. After checking which states the stores were located in, the police determined that Sarah was traveling from Kansas to Texas. They also reviewed surveillance footage from these stores and confirmed that it was indeed Sarah making the calls, and that she was alone at the time. It became clear that she hadn't been abducted. Sarah was now the prime suspect in Harold's murder. On January 25, 2014, 11 days after the murder, 19-year-old Sarah was found by park rangers asleep in Harold's car. This happened in the Everglades National Park at around 10:30 p.m. When the rangers woke her to arrest her, they discovered a loaded gun by her side. A search of the car revealed another firearm, illegal substances, an axe, and 2 knives. After her arrest, Sarah was not immediately extradited to Kansas. Instead, she remained in Florida, where she was interrogated by several investigators. She didn't resist and didn't try to come up with a story. Sarah quickly confessed to killing Harold and fleeing the scene. She told the officers that he had been tormenting her and that she saw no other way to escape him. Sarah shared the details of what had happened. She said that, a few days before the murder, she went to the pharmacy while Harold was out and bought a pack of sleeping pills. On January 14th, 3 days before Harold's body was discovered, she had a day off. Harold had started doing some repairs around the house and asked Sarah to bring him a beer. She said that it was at that moment she realized this was her chance. Sarah knew Harold wouldn't stop at just 1 beer. He would keep asking for more. After he finished his 3rd beer, she began crushing the pills and mixing them into his drinks. She said she waited until the 3rd can because she knew Harold wouldn't notice the strange taste by then. Each time he asked for another beer, she added more pills to it. According to the police, she gave him a total of 5 tablets. This medication, combined with alcohol, caused Harold to lose consciousness. At that moment, Sarah quickly tied his hands and feet. According to her, Harold regained consciousness for about a minute and mumbled something. Sarah couldn't fully understand him, but admitted that, for a brief moment, she felt sorry for him. Yet she was determined to follow through with her plan. She grabbed a knife and inflicted several wounds to his neck, nearly decapitating him. Once Sarah realized Harold was dead, she used his blood to write the word "freedom" on the bathroom wall. Afterward, she washed her hands, took a shower, and changed into clean clothes. Then she took money, a tablet, and Harold's car, and left. She explained that she purposely left her phone behind so that the police wouldn't track it and would think something had happened to her as well. Sarah began driving toward Texas. However, when she got there, she didn't like it. It was too cold at night. So she decided to head to Florida instead. On the way, Sarah mostly slept in the car, stopping at rest areas along the highway. Once in Florida, she visited James Baker, a local tattoo artist, to get a new tattoo. This wasn't her first tattoo. She already had the phrase "Only God Can Judge Me" on her shoulder. For her second tattoo, Sarah chose a quote from a book: "Beware the dark pit at the bottom of our hearts. In its icy black depths dwell strange, twisted creatures that are better left undisturbed." Sarah hoped that by cooperating with the police and sharing her story about Harold's abuse, they would show her leniency and reduce her sentence. But the officers chose not to do so. Instead, they portrayed Sarah as a true psychopath and Harold as a calm Catholic man who had only wanted to help her. During one of the interrogations, Sarah confessed to an officer that while living in Harold's house, she often experienced fits of rage, and with them, the desire to kill. Prosecutors argued that Sarah killed Harold not because he had been abusive, but because she wanted to know what it felt like to take a life. The police also discovered a message on Sarah's phone where Harold apologized to her for forcing her into sexual relations. However, this message was not presented to the jury during the first trial. All evidence and testimonies regarding Harold's abuse of Sarah were ignored to ensure she would be held fully accountable for the crime. In February 2014, Sarah's trial began. Her attorney decided not to use the evidence of Harold's abusive behavior toward her, as the charges did not take them into account. Instead, he chose a risky strategy. The attorney proposed that Sarah attempt to prove her innocence by pleading insanity, claiming that she suffered from dissociative identity disorder. According to Sarah, her lawyer assured her that this strategy would lead to her freedom. The defense argued that Sarah had developed multiple alter egos to cope with the abuse she endured. One of these personalities, Vanessa, was described as a fragile and vulnerable girl who planned to die to escape Harold. But another personality, Lisa, who was dark and ruthless, decided to kill him instead to prevent that from happening. Additionally, there was Mila, who wrote Bible verses, and an unnamed personality that stored memories of the abuse. The attorney claimed that all these personalities formed what he called Sarah's system, and that the real Sarah disappeared after being raped by Harold's friend. Sarah expressed remorse for her actions and apologized to Harold's family. However, her defense strategy failed. Neither the judge nor the jury believed a single word of it. The prosecution presented an alternative, well-crafted narrative. They focused on the claim that Sarah killed Harold simply to experience what it was like to take a life. They argued that, despite Harold's coercion, the sexual relationship between them was consensual and not part of any abuse. Moreover, since the defense had already introduced the topic of trauma and Sarah's past experiences, the prosecution dismissed them as lies, ignoring the fact that Sarah had indeed received psychological treatment for what she had endured. They continued to portray Harold as a calm, religious man who was simply trying to help a troubled teenager, and claimed that Sarah took advantage of him. Prosecutors even alleged that the drugs found in Harold's house were not brought there by him, but were purchased by Sarah herself, although they had no evidence to support this claim. The only thing the prosecution could prove beyond doubt was that Sarah had already planned Harold's murder. When they examined her phone, they found several messages sent to her sister in which Sarah stated she had found a way to get rid of Harold for good. This allowed the prosecution to convince the judge that the crime was premeditated and deliberate. To further support their hypothesis, they reviewed Sarah's browser history and discovered that, for a month before the murder, she had been researching weak points in the human neck and methods for attacking someone. On September 4, 2015, Sarah, who was 21 years old at the time, was found guilty of first-degree premeditated murder and sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 50 years. After the verdict was handed down, all the information about the abuse from Harold and the testimonies that the prosecution had disregarded became public, and the case received widespread media attention. It was revealed that much of the information regarding Sarah and Harold's relationship had been hidden from the jury. The reason for this remains unclear, whether it was to protect Harold's image as a quiet, religious man, or if the prosecution simply aimed to secure the harshest possible sentence for Sarah. But in the end, this only drew more public attention to the case. In 2021, Sarah struck a deal with the prosecution, which allowed her to reduce her sentence from 50 to 25 years. While she is still serving a life sentence, she will be eligible for parole after 25 years and can request her release at that time.
Thanks for watching, friends. What do you think about this story? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'm always interested in your opinions. Subscribe to my channel. There's much more to come. See you next time.